The Los Angeles County Courthouse was suffocating. The air inside felt thick, charged with the tension of a room full of people waiting for the inevitable. Spectators lined the gallery, whispering among themselves as the trial was about to unfold. At the defendant's table stood Ethan Brooks, a 19-year-old accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He looked almost out of place in the courtroom, standing next to the large table, his hands casually shoved into his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show a glimmer of defiance. Judge Charles Daniels sat high up at the bench, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished wood of his desk. With his glasses perched low on his nose, he observed Ethan from over the rim, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ethan had the look of someone who didn't belong here, a kid in trouble who hadn't quite figured out the gravity of the situation. "You think you're some kind of legal expert, don't you?" Judge Daniels' voice rang out, dripping with dry amusement. The words landed with the weight of a verdict. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor were all in on the joke. Everyone thought this was just another kid trying to pull a fast one in front of the court. But Ethan didn't flinch. There were no nerves, no tension in his posture. He simply stared back at the judge with steady eyes. This wasn't some random case to him. He'd been preparing for this moment for years. It wasn't a case he ever expected to be in. He never thought he'd be the one in the defendant's chair. But he knew the law like the back of his hand. His mother, Margaret Brooks, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and Ethan had spent his childhood listening to her stories. He learned the ins and outs of the legal world long before most kids learned to ride a bike. While his friends played video games, Ethan spent his time reading case law and imagining trial strategies in his head. At 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students, but none of that mattered to Judge Daniels. To him, Ethan was just another delinquent. "Let's make this quick," Judge Daniels sighed, flipping through the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The room chuckled again, but this time something shifted. Ethan's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smirk. He wasn't laughing, because Judge Daniels had just made his first mistake. The truth about Ethan Brooks wasn't written in his arrest report. It wasn't in the dash cam footage or the police testimony. It was in his upbringing. The courtroom could not know how many years he had spent studying the law, not because he wanted to be a criminal, but because he wanted to understand the system. Ethan's mother, Margaret, had worked as a paralegal for 2 decades, and from a young age, Ethan had been intrigued by the stories she brought home from the office. She would talk about cases where the prosecution had cut corners, judges who played favorites, and defense attorneys who barely bothered to show up. Through it all, Ethan had absorbed everything, learning not just the facts of the law, but the way the system worked, or often didn't work. By the time he was 14, Ethan could dissect a trial better than most law students. His friends were busy memorizing sports stats, but Ethan had a different hobby. He would sit in his room for hours, arguing imaginary cases with himself, playing both the role of the defendant and the prosecutor. His friends never understood his obsession. They would joke about how Ethan was always talking law instead of playing basketball or video games. But Ethan didn't mind. The law was his game. It was his playground. And when the time came, when he found himself in this courtroom, it was no longer just a hobby. It was his weapon. Ethan's knowledge of the system didn't end with his mother's stories. His passion for the law was a way of protecting himself. He understood that the system wasn't always fair, and in a world where people were often judged by appearances, knowing the law was his armor. It was the reason he knew that in this courtroom, he was more than just another teenager facing a charge. He was a player in a much bigger game. Judge Daniels didn't know any of this. To him, Ethan was just another kid who had run afoul of the law, a young man who had probably gotten caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw Ethan's defiance as arrogance, the posture of a young man who thought he knew more than he did. But what Daniels didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't a regular defendant. This wasn't his first time in a courtroom, and he wasn't here to plead guilty. He was here to fight back. As the prosecutor, William Harmon, stood up to present his case, Ethan's eyes narrowed. Harmon was the type of prosecutor who seemed to believe his job was done with a well-crafted speech and a stack of evidence. Ethan wasn't intimidated. In fact, he welcomed the challenge. Harmon began speaking in that practiced tone of a man who had delivered the same speech hundreds of times. "Your Honor, the defendant, Ethan Brooks, was found in possession of a stolen vehicle, a 2022 BMW M3, reported missing just hours before his arrest. The police pursued him through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. Harmon's voice was cold, calculated. The fingerprints found on the steering wheel were a clear indication of his guilt. Ethan listened carefully, his mind already working. Harmon's case sounded solid on the surface, but it was just the beginning. Judge Daniels gave Harmon a nod, signaling for him to continue. The prosecutor moved to the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Ethan's focus didn't waver. He had already found the cracks in Harmon's case, and he was going to make sure everyone else saw them too. When Judge Daniels turned to the defense, his expression was almost dismissive. He didn't expect much. The defense attorney, Ava Sinclair, had barely spoken a word since the trial began. She looked like she was just trying to make it through the day without any major screw-ups. It wasn't hard to see why. The case against Ethan was straightforward. Too straightforward, in fact. And Ava was no match for the seasoned prosecutor, William Harmon. But Ethan had something else in mind. Without warning, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The courtroom went still. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice calm, controlled, "I will be representing myself." A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Daniels blinked, clearly caught off guard. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "You'll what?" His voice was a mixture of confusion and amusement. "This isn't a debate club, young man." The spectators chuckled again, but this time the laughter was nervous. It was clear that no one, not even Harmon, had expected this move. Ethan stood tall, his hands still in his pockets, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "I'll be defending myself," Ethan repeated, his eyes locked on the judge. His tone was steady, unwavering. The prosecutor, William Harmon, let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This should be interesting," he muttered under his breath, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression that he quickly masked. Ethan knew exactly what he was doing. While Ava sat back down, seemingly reluctant to interfere, Ethan made his way to the defendant's table. He didn't need notes, didn't need anything. He had spent years preparing for this moment, years of listening to his mother's stories, years of studying the law, and now, this was his time. Without rushing, he stepped forward, adjusting his stance in the space before the jury. He took a slow breath, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then finally he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Harmon raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. "Go ahead." Ethan's eyes were fixed on him now, unblinking. "You said Officer Michael Rios personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before I was arrested. Is that correct?" The prosecutor's lips tightened into a thin smile. "That's right. His testimony is in the report, as well as his body cam footage. It's all there." Ethan nodded slowly, processing the information. He turned back to Daniels, his voice almost casual. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Judge Daniels' brow furrowed in confusion. "On what grounds?" Ethan stepped forward, now fully engaged. "Officer Rios wasn't even on duty when the chase began. He never saw me behind the wheel of that car." He paused, letting the words settle. "And I'd like to request a verification of Officer Rios's GPS logs from that night. If his report claims he was in a specific location, then the GPS data should match. But I have a feeling it won't." A ripple of whispers filled the gallery, and Harmon's smug expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" Harmon shot back. "That's preposterous. We have an officer's report and the footage. What's your point?" Ethan ignored him, his focus now entirely on the judge. "Your Honor, if Officer Rios was where he claims to be, the GPS data should corroborate his report. If not..." Ethan let the sentence hang in the air. "We've got a problem." Judge Daniels' gaze shifted between Harmon and Ethan, the first sign of hesitation flickering across his face. The prosecutor's confident facade was cracking, just enough to let the doubt seep in. "Counselor Harmon," Judge Daniels said slowly, his voice dropping, "do you have any objections to verifying Officer Rios' GPS logs?" Harmon hesitated. It was a long pause, just long enough for the jury and everyone in the courtroom to notice. The prosecutor's bravado seemed to be slipping. Finally, Harmon exhaled sharply. "No objections, Your Honor." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. Ethan didn't smile, but inside he knew. He had just made his first move, and the case was already starting to shift. The shift in the courtroom was palpable. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery, and for the first time that day, the air felt different. The laughter and casual jokes had evaporated, replaced by a tense, almost uncomfortable silence. Ethan was no longer the scared teenager in the defendant's chair. He was now a formidable adversary, methodically pulling apart the prosecution's case. He stood there for a moment, gathering his thoughts. His eyes scanned the jury, reading their faces as he prepared for the next phase of his defense. This was no longer just about questioning a police officer's GPS logs. This was about making everyone in that room see the cracks in the entire case, the flaws, the shortcuts, the assumptions. Ethan was about to expose them all. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice steady but firm, "while we wait for the GPS records to be verified, I'd like to address something else. The fingerprints found on the steering wheel of the vehicle." Judge Daniels nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Ethan turned toward Harmon, who was already flipping through his notes, a sense of unease settling over him. The prosecutor wasn't prepared for this. "Now, Harmon wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints on a stolen vehicle means I must have stolen it," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the room with precision. He paced slightly, looking from one juror to the next, making eye contact with each one. "But let's think about this logically for a moment." A few of the jurors shifted in their seats, intrigued by the sudden turn in the trial. Ethan could feel the eyes on him, but he didn't rush. He wanted them to understand. "Imagine this," Ethan continued, his tone calm and controlled. "You walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, and then you hang it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" There was a brief silence in the courtroom, and a few jurors exchanged glances. Ethan let the question hang in the air, letting it settle. His words weren't accusatory, but they were effective. They made the jury think. "Now," Ethan pressed on, "the car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes," he added with a shrug, "when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was unlocked. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't take the car, I didn't drive it, and I didn't steal anything from inside. It was just a dumb moment of curiosity. That's it." He paused, letting the words sink in. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and Ethan could tell the jury was starting to reconsider the evidence they had been presented with. "Does touching something automatically make you a criminal?" Ethan asked, his voice cutting through the whispers in the room. His words were measured, deliberate, forcing everyone to look at the evidence in a new light. Harmon cleared his throat loudly, flipping through his notes, trying to regain control of the situation. But Ethan wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic," Ethan said, turning back to Judge Daniels, "let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. Was the forensic specialist who processed that evidence subpoenaed to testify?" Judge Daniels blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Harmon, who was clearly struggling to keep his composure. "No," Harmon admitted reluctantly. "But," Ethan raised a hand, cutting him off. "So, to be clear, the state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed the evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine them, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" There was a collective shift in the room as the weight of Ethan's words sank in. Harmon's jaw tightened, but he had no immediate response. Ethan had just pointed out a critical flaw in the prosecution's case, one that couldn't easily be dismissed. "That's interesting," Ethan said softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "If the state is so confident in their evidence, why didn't they bring in the expert?" The moment hung in the air. The courtroom was still, the tension almost unbearable. Harmon shuffled his papers, but Ethan could see the cracks in his facade beginning to widen. The prosecutor was no longer the man in control, but Ethan wasn't finished. He had one more piece of the puzzle to lay before the jury, the final blow to the prosecution's argument. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Harmon as he prepared to make his final move. The courtroom was still, the weight of the case now squarely on his shoulders. He had been methodical in his approach, pulling apart every piece of the prosecution's argument one by one. But now, with the moment of truth before him, Ethan knew the time had come to deliver the final blow. He took a deep breath, then turned to Judge Daniels, his voice firm and unwavering. "Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence an official statement from the owner of the stolen vehicle." Mr. Raymond Foster. Judge Daniels looked up from his papers, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. "The owner?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Raymond Foster, the registered owner of the vehicle, provided a statement to the police on the night his car was reported stolen. That statement, however, was conveniently omitted from the prosecution's filings." A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. Ethan's words were starting to hit harder, one by one. Harmon shifted in his seat, his face pale, but he didn't speak. Ethan was about to reveal what would shatter the case once and for all. Ethan reached into his folder and pulled out a printed transcript of the police report. He held it up for everyone in the courtroom to see. "This," he said, his voice cutting through the room, "is the original police report. Mr. Foster told the officers, and I quote, 'I left my car running when I went inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off with it. But it wasn't the person you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white.'" A collective gasp spread across the courtroom. Harmon's face went white, and for the first time, the confidence of the prosecution began to crumble. Ethan let the words hang in the air, the implications settling into the minds of everyone present. "That's from the original report," Ethan continued, holding the paper up for emphasis. "The same report the prosecution conveniently chose not to mention. And yet," he said, turning to the jury, "they want you to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." The room was electric now. Ethan's argument was undeniable. The truth was clear, and it was impossible to ignore. The prosecution had failed to disclose key evidence that would have exonerated him. And in doing so, they had built their entire case on a false assumption. Harmon rose quickly, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant," he shouted, his voice shaking with frustration. "The defendant was caught in possession of the stolen vehicle. That's the fact." Ethan shook his head, his voice steady but cutting through the prosecutor's outburst. "No, Mr. Harmon, I wasn't caught in possession of anything. I wasn't in that car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." A deep silence filled the courtroom as Ethan's words hung in the air. The weight of his defense was undeniable. The case was falling apart, and even Judge Daniels knew it. The judge let out a slow breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if trying to stave off a headache. The case was unraveling quickly now, the threads of doubt too numerous to ignore. He glanced over at the jury, who were now visibly shaken by the revelations. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Judge Daniels looked down at his gavel. He took a moment, then turned to Harmon, his voice low and deliberate. "Does the prosecution have anything further to add?" Harmon stood, his face flushed, his shoulders stiff. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice almost resigned. The finality in his voice was clear. There was nothing left to say. The case was over. Judge Daniels leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "The case is dismissed," he said simply. The words hung in the air for a moment, then the chaos erupted. A mix of disbelief and relief swept through the courtroom. Some people were whispering, others were shaking their heads in astonishment. The gallery was a whirlwind of activity as reporters scrambled to write down every detail. But Ethan didn't move right away. He stood still, allowing the moment to settle, letting the weight of his victory wash over him. He had done it. He had not only won the case, but he had also made a mockery of the system that had tried to convict him on a flimsy, biased foundation. As he turned to leave, Judge Daniels spoke again, his voice quiet but pointed. "Mr. Brooks," he called. Ethan paused but didn't turn around. "You should consider law school," Judge Daniel said, his tone almost thoughtful. Ethan finally allowed a small smirk to cross his face, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The judge's words, though well-intentioned, were unnecessary. Ethan had already made his path clear. Law school wasn't something he had to consider. It was something he was already planning. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters surrounded him, their cameras flashing as they thrust microphones in his face. They wanted to know if he knew the case would be dismissed. They asked him how it felt to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor. But Ethan wasn't interested in the spectacle. He pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and walked past them, ignoring the questions. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Margaret, was waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. She studied him for a long moment before finally letting out a breath. "Boy," she said, her voice low, "you scared me half to death." Ethan chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him for a moment longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." As they walked away, Ethan felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. But he knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't the end of his story. He wasn't just going to stop here. The courtroom had already seen him as a defendant, but the next time he stepped into one, it wouldn't be as a criminal. It would be as an attorney.